The deed landed on the table between them like a gunshot. Grace Brenner stared at it, the yellowed paper trembling in Perry Warren's scarred hand, his knuckles white where he gripped the edge. The lamp on the rough-hewn table cast long shadows across the room, and outside, the Kansas wind howled through the cracks in the walls of the Dustfall Ranch's main house. It was the autumn of 1883, and the world Grace had known for the past 2 years was dissolving beneath her feet. "Read it," Perry said. His voice was low, rough as gravel, and she could hear something underneath it that she had never heard from this man before. It was not anger. It was not the cold, controlled distance he wore like armor. It was something far more dangerous than either of those things. It was grief. "Read the name on the deed, Grace." She did not want to touch the paper. She did not want to see what was written there, because some part of her already knew, already felt the shape of the truth before it became words. But her hand moved anyway, the way hands do when the heart has already decided even if the mind is still resisting. Her fingers closed around the deed and she pulled it toward her across the table. The fire crackled in the hearth. A horse whinnied somewhere in the distant dark. Grace Brenner read the name, her own. "This was always meant to belong to you," Perry said, and there was something in his voice that broke open the whole past 2 years like a cracked walnut, spilling secrets she had never been allowed to see. The North Pasture deed, 40 acres of the finest grazing land in Caldwell County. The parcel that 3 men had already died over, that had been the subject of courthouse battles and midnight threats, that Perry himself had told her was unentailed and unsellable when she had first arrived at Dustfall Ranch as his hired housekeeper in the summer of 1881. The land that her father, Thomas Brenner, had homesteaded and lost in a rigged court proceeding before Grace was old enough to understand what loss meant. Her father's name was not on this deed. Her name was. Thomas Brenner had put it there, and Perry Warren had been keeping it safe for 2 years, waiting for a moment that had never seemed to come until tonight, when everything had finally cracked open and the secrets could not be held anymore. Grace looked up at him. At the scar that ran from the corner of his left eye down to his jaw, pale and familiar now, in a way that it had not been when she first arrived, when it had frightened her a little in its severity. She knew the story of that scar now, or she thought she did. She had thought she knew most things about Perry Warren. She was learning tonight how profoundly wrong she had been. "How long?" she asked. He did not answer immediately. He pulled the chair across from her and sat down, and he looked older tonight, though he was only 31. The lamplight made the angles of his face sharp and tired, and the scar seemed to pull at the corner of his eye in a way that gave him a perpetual expression of sorrow. "From the beginning," he said, "the wind hit the side of the house hard enough to rattle the window panes." "Tell me everything," Grace said. "Every secret, every hidden thing. Perry, if you have ever trusted me at all, tell me now." And he did. He told her all of it. But to understand what he told her, you have to go back to the beginning. Back to the summer of 1881, when Grace Brenner stepped off the stage in Caldwell, Kansas, with $23, a carpetbag, and a determination so fierce it was nearly indistinguishable from desperation. She was 24 years old when she arrived in Caldwell. She had spent the 3 years prior to that working as a seamstress in St. Louis, sending money home to her father on the homestead outside of town. But the money had never been enough to outpace the debt that a man named Hector Voss had been engineering against Thomas Brenner for nearly a decade. Voss was the largest landowner in Caldwell County, a man whose influence in the courthouse was so thorough that judges bent when he walked into a room. He wanted the Brenner land. He had always wanted it. The North Pasture in particular sat along the creek that fed the entire western portion of his grazing operation, and he had decided years ago that it would be his. Thomas Brenner had refused to sell. He had refused every offer, every threat, every manipulation. He was a stubborn man, Irish-descended and proud, and the land was not just land to him. It was the thing he had built with his own broken hands after arriving in Kansas with nothing, and he would not let it go. So Hector Voss had found another way. Debts appeared that Thomas had not incurred. A promissory note surfaced with his signature on it, though Grace would later learn the signature had been forged. A drought year hit the entire region, and the Brenner cattle operation shrank to almost nothing, and the bank, which Voss had a controlling interest in, called in a loan that had previously been extended. Thomas Brenner lost the homestead in a civil court proceeding in the spring of 1881. He lost everything except the North Pasture deed, which he had never put through the county recorder's office under his own name, having transferred it quietly into his daughter's name years before with a lawyer in Wichita, keeping the deed out of the reach of any judgment against Thomas Brenner personally. Thomas Brenner died 6 weeks after losing the homestead. Grace received the letter while she was still in St. Louis. The doctor in Caldwell wrote that it was his heart. Grace had no doubt that it was, only not in the way the doctor meant. Her father had died of grief. The land had been his life, and when it was taken, he had simply stopped. She came back to Caldwell with $23 and the burning need to understand what had happened, to find what remained of her father's legacy, and to make something out of the ruins. She did not know about the deed yet. Thomas had told her nothing of it in letters. She would learn later that he had been afraid that if she knew, she might come back and put herself in Voss's path. Her father had always underestimated her. The position at Dustfall Ranch had been advertised at the dry goods store on 2nd Street. Housekeeper and cook wanted, fair wages, references preferred but not required. She had taken it because it was work, and because it was outside the town where Voss's eyes and ears were thickest, and because the ranch's owner, a man named Perry Warren, had a reputation as a fair and private employer who kept to himself and asked only honest labor in return. She had heard about the scar before she saw it. The town talked about Perry Warren with that particular mixture of respect and wariness that the frontier reserved for men who had survived things others had not. He had come to Caldwell County in 1877 from somewhere in Texas, had purchased Dustfall Ranch from a widow who was selling out and heading east, and had built it into a solid cattle operation over 4 years of relentless work. He did not drink to excess. He did not gamble. He did not involve himself in politics or courthouse business. He was, by all accounts, a man who had made a deliberate choice to live quietly after having once lived otherwise. Grace had heard whispers that the scar was from the war, though the timing was wrong. Perry had been too young for the war. She had heard that it was from a knife fight, or from a branding accident, or from a fire. The truth, she would eventually learn, was something more complicated than any of those stories, and it was connected to secrets that reached all the way back to Hector Voss and to her father's land. But on the day she arrived at Dustfall Ranch, carpetbag in hand and hair pinned severely under a practical hat, all she knew was that Perry Warren was a tall man with a scarred face who looked at her with gray eyes that seemed to see considerably more than she was offering to show. "You're Thomas Brenner's daughter," he said. It was not a question. She had been startled. "You knew my father. He was a neighbor," Perry said. His expression had not changed. "I'm sorry for your loss." She had thanked him and asked if the position was still available. He had said yes and showed her the house, which was large and well-built but sparsely furnished, with the air of a place that was occupied by practicality rather than comfort. She had seen the way he moved through it, not quite at home even in his own rooms, and she had thought that Perry Warren was a lonely man, though she had not yet thought that was anything to do with her. The work was hard and the days were long, but Grace had never been afraid of either of those things. She cooked 3 meals a day, kept the house clean, managed the supply ordering in town, and in the evening she often sat on the porch with her mending while the last light faded from the prairie sky, watching the long grass bend in the wind. Dustfall Ranch was beautiful in a stark and unadorned way, and the North Pasture was the most beautiful part of it. She had not known then that it was technically hers. The first time Perry sat with her on the porch, it was an accident of circumstance. He had come out to check on the horses and found her sitting there, and instead of going back inside, He had leaned against the post and looked out over the land with her in companionable silence. She had learned quickly that Perry Warren was a man comfortable with silence, which was fortunate because she was too. After years in the chattering noise of St. Louis, the silence of the prairie felt like something she had been starving for. "The North Pasture is beautiful this time of year," she had said, because it was, and because she felt the pull of that particular piece of land in a way that she could not entirely explain. Perry had looked at her then with that particular quality of attention that she was starting to recognize as characteristic of him, as if he were measuring something internal that he was not going to share yet. "Yes," he said, "it is." She had not thought anything of it then. By September of that first year, she had settled into Dustfall the way roots settle into soil, gradually and without drama, until one day you realize the settling has happened and you are no longer separate from the place you are in. She knew the names of the ranch hands, 4 of them, young men from various parts of Kansas and 1 from Oklahoma. She knew the rhythms of the cattle operation. She knew the way Perry took his coffee, which was black and strong enough to stand a spoon in, and she knew the particular set of his shoulders when something was wrong on the ranch versus something wrong in town, because the two produced different silences in him. She did not know the first thing about what was wrong in town. Not yet. Hector Voss came to Dustfall Ranch for the first time in October of 1881. Grace was in the kitchen when his wagon rolled up, and she watched through the window as he climbed down and walked toward the house with the measured confidence of a man who expected doors to open for him. He was 62 years old, heavy in the chest and shoulders, with a silver mustache and eyes the color of old copper. He had the look of a man who had decided long ago that the world was a resource to be extracted. Perry had met him at the door. Grace had not been able to hear the conversation from the kitchen, but she had watched Perry's posture, and what she saw there had troubled her. Not fear, precisely, but something guarded and tightly held, the posture of a man managing a situation that required very careful management. After Voss left, Perry had been quieter than usual through supper. He had thanked her for the meal with the same courtesy he always showed, and then he had gone to his study and closed the door. She had not asked, but she had begun to watch more carefully after that, and what she watched began to teach her things. She learned that Voss visited the ranch approximately once a month, always with some pretext of neighborly business, always departing after a conversation with Perry that left the air feeling charged. She learned that Perry always declined whatever Voss suggested, because she could read the body language even when she could not hear the words. She learned that after these visits, Perry sometimes rode out alone to the North Pasture and stood there in the tall grass for 20 minutes or half an hour, as if the land itself were something he needed to consult. She started to wonder. The first real conversation she and Perry had, the kind that goes beneath the surface of daily logistics, happened in November of 1881. There had been a hard frost, and the ranch hands had gone to town for the evening, and Grace had made a pot of stew that was too large for one person, and had knocked on the study door to ask if Perry wanted to eat with her rather than alone. He had looked surprised, and then something in his expression had softened just slightly, the way a window crack lets in more light than you expect. "I would like that," he said. They ate at the kitchen table, and at first the conversation was the practical kind, about the herd and the coming winter, and whether the supply order from Wichita would arrive before the roads became impassable. But then, gradually, it shifted. "You went to see your father's grave last week," Perry said. Not an accusation, just an observation. He had seen her ride out that direction. "Yes," Grace said. "I go every few weeks." "I respected Thomas Brenner," Perry said. "He was a man who didn't bend." She looked at him. "You knew him better than just as a neighbor." It was not quite a question. Perry considered it for a moment, turning his coffee cup in his hands. "He was a good man who had a great injustice done to him," Perry said carefully. "I am sorry I was not able to prevent it." "Were you in a position to prevent it?" Something moved behind his gray eyes. Not by the time I understood what was happening, he said. Voss is patient. He works over years, not months. By the time the shape of it becomes visible, the damage is already most of the way done. Grace set down her own cup. Why does Voss keep coming here? Perry met her eyes. Because he wants the North Pasture, he said. He has always wanted it. It was part of your father's original homestead. When Thomas lost the rest of the land, the North Pasture did not transfer with the judgment because it was held separately. Voss has been trying to acquire it ever since. Grace went very still. My father's North Pasture, she said slowly. Yes. But that land is part of Dustfall Ranch now. I see the cattle grazing on it. Your father sold me the right to graze it, Perry said, before the judgment. He needed cash quickly and he trusted me, but the deed itself, the ownership of the land, that is a different matter. Grace felt something move through her like a cold current. Where is the deed? Perry looked at her for a long moment that seemed to contain more words than it was releasing. Safe, he said finally, and then, with a deliberateness that seemed to cost him something, your father kept it safe, and then he made sure it would stay safe. She had wanted to push further. She could feel the edge of the secret from where she was sitting, like the edge of a cliff in the dark. But Perry's expression had closed slightly, the way a door closes when the draft comes through, and she understood intuitively that pressing would not open it. Whatever he was keeping it for a reason, and Perry Warren was not a man whose reasons were small. She let it rest. But she did not forget it. The winter of 1881 into 1882 brought its hardships, as Kansas winters did, with blizzards that kept everyone indoors for days and cold that killed 3 head of cattle and tested the character of every person on the ranch. Grace proved her character to Perry's ranch hands during those weeks, and she knew it because she could see the shift in how they treated her, the deference becoming something warmer and more genuine. She was proving her character to Perry too, though she did not know he was watching quite as closely as he was. In January, there was a night when one of the ranch hands, a young man named Colton, took sick with a fever that turned dangerous quickly. Perry had ridden for the doctor in town, but the doctor was delayed by a storm, and Grace had spent the night managing Colton's fever with cold compresses and herbal teas and sheer iron-willed vigilance. When Perry returned in the early morning, exhausted from the ride, he had found Grace still at Colton's bedside, her sleeves rolled up and her hair loose from its pins, and the fever had already begun to break. He had stood in the doorway for a moment looking at her. You could have gone to sleep, he said. The hands would have managed. He's 20 years old, she said. He was frightened. Perry had looked at her with that measuring quality again, but this time there was something else mixed into it, something warmer and less guarded. Can I get you anything? He asked. It was such a simple question, so much smaller than the night warranted, but something in the asking of it, the quiet care behind it, had lodged itself under her ribs and stayed there. Coffee, she said. Black. He brought it himself, rather than waking anyone, and he sat with her for an hour while Colton slept, and they talked in low voices about things that were neither practical nor surface level. She told him about her mother who had died when Grace was 12, and the way her father had raised her with a kind of gruff tenderness that she had not always appreciated until it was gone. Perry listened in the way he did everything, completely and without interruption, and then he told her about growing up in Central Texas, and the dry summers, and a father who had been a different kind of man entirely. He did not tell her about the scar, not that night. But the distance between them had shifted. It was not something you could measure with a ruler, but it was real. Spring came slowly, the way it does on the Kansas plains, grass greening inch by inch and the creek rising, and the cattle regaining the weight they had lost in the cold months. Grace found herself spending more time outside as the weather permitted, walking the property the way she had walked as a child on her father's homestead, learning the land the way you learn a person, by the particular light on it at different hours and the way it smells after rain. She walked to the North Pasture often. Always she found herself drawn there, to those 40 acres of bottomland with the creek running through it, and the old cottonwood trees along the bank. There was something about the land that felt familiar in a way she could not explain, as if her body remembered it before her mind caught up. One afternoon in April she found Perry there, not riding, just standing at the fence line with his hands in his pockets and his hat pushed back, looking at the cottonwoods. "You come here a lot," she said, walking up beside him. "So do you," he said. They stood together in silence for a while. The creek made its quiet sounds, and a meadowlark sang somewhere in the tall grass, and the late afternoon light was gold on everything. "My father used to bring me here," Grace said. She surprised herself with it because she had not intended to say it. But the words came out with the certainty of something that has been waiting. "When I was small, before my mother died, he used to say this piece of land was special, that it had something in the soil that everything else around here was missing." Perry did not move, but she felt a change in his stillness, a sharpened quality. "He loved this land," Perry said. "Yes," Grace looked at the creek. "I sometimes think I love it too, even though it was never mine." Perry turned to look at her. She looked back. There was something in his expression that she could not read, something old and complicated, and under it something new and much simpler. "Grace," he said, and then he stopped. She waited. He shook his head slightly. "Nothing. Just that your father would be glad you're here." She thought about that all the way back to the house. She thought about it through making supper and through the evening and into the night, lying in the small bedroom off the kitchen that was hers. She thought about Perry standing at the fence line, and the way he had said her name, and the thing that had been in his face before he decided not to say what he had been about to say. She was not a foolish woman. She had known for some months that her feelings for Perry Warren were not the feelings of a housekeeper for an employer. She had known it and set it aside with practical efficiency because whatever those feelings were, acting on them was not a luxury she could afford. She had no property, no money beyond her wages, no family remaining in the world. If she allowed herself to feel things that could not go anywhere without embarrassing them both, she would lose her position and her home and the tentative safety she had built out of almost nothing. She also suspected, with increasing certainty, that Perry was keeping something from her. Something significant, and until she knew what that was, any feelings she might have for him were built on uncertain ground. She was right on all counts, as it turned out. The truth began to come apart in the summer of 1882, when Hector Voss escalated his campaign. He had sent men to the ranch twice in June to make offers on the North Pasture that Perry had declined. After the second visit, Perry had ridden to Caldwell and come back looking like a man who had been given news he had always expected but had hoped to avoid. He told Grace that evening that the situation with Voss had become more complicated, but he offered no details, and his expression did not invite questions. Then in July, Grace was in town for the weekly supply run when she overheard a conversation in the dry goods store that sent ice through her veins. Two men she did not know were talking near the back of the store, their voices low but not low enough. She heard Voss's name. She heard the words North Pasture deed. She heard the Brenner girl doesn't know and Warren's the only one keeping it quiet, and then a laugh that she did not like at all. She bought her supplies with her hands steady and her face composed, and she drove back to Dustfall Ranch, and she went directly to find Perry. He was in the barn, working with one of the horses, and he looked up when she came in with the expression of a man who sees a storm in someone's face and starts estimating how bad it will be. "What did you know about my father's deed?" she asked. The real answer, Perry, not the careful answer. He set down the brush in his hand. He looked at her for a long moment. "Let's go inside," he said. "Tell me here." He rubbed the back of his neck in that way he had when he was working through something difficult. "Grace," he said, "I have been trying to protect you." "From what?" "From having to know something that would put you in Voss's path before you were in a position to defend yourself." She stared at him. "What something?" He looked at the horse, and then back at her, and she could see the moment when he made his decision, the moment when the weight of the secret became heavier than the reasons for keeping it. "Before your father died," Perry said, "he came to me. He had already known for several months that he was going to lose the homestead. Voss had too much control over the bank and the courthouse to fight it directly, but your father had taken precautions years before that Voss didn't know about. Grace held very still. He had transferred the North Pasture deed into your name, Perry said, through a lawyer in Wichita. The deed was recorded quietly, without going through the Caldwell County recorder, so there was no record locally that Voss could find. Your father kept the deed itself with me for safekeeping, because he trusted me and because he knew Voss's men might search his property when the judgment came. Grace opened her mouth and then closed it again. He asked me to hold it until you came back to Caldwell, Perry continued, or until I judged the time was right. He made me promise not to tell you immediately, because he was afraid Voss would learn you had it and move against you before you were established and protected. He paused. I have been wrestling with that promise ever since you arrived, because keeping it has meant keeping things from you that are yours to know. The heat of July in the barn was very present suddenly. A horse stamped. Dust moved in the shaft of light through the high window. I own the North Pasture, Grace said. Yes. I have owned it since before I arrived at Dustfall. Yes, she looked at him. She did not know in that moment whether what she felt was closer to gratitude or fury. It was threaded through with something that hurt in a way she had not expected. You have been housing me, she said slowly, and paying me wages on land that is technically mine. Yes. He held her gaze without flinching. I am aware of how that appears. And Voss suspects there is an outstanding deed but cannot locate it. His current strategy is to pressure me to sell the grazing rights, which he hopes will lead to him eventually acquiring the title. He does not yet know your name is on it. But those men in town today knew. Perry's expression sharpened. Which men? She described what she had heard. She watched something shift in Perry's face, something cold and careful replacing the openness that had been there moments before. That is a problem, he said quietly. If Voss's people have learned your name is on the deed, the situation has changed. How has it changed? He looked at her, and what she saw in his face then was something she had not seen before. It was the first time she saw the depth of the concern he had been holding on her behalf, the long, ongoing vigilance of a man who had been standing between her and a danger she had not known existed. It means you need to know everything, he said, and we need to make decisions together. That word together landed differently than he likely intended it, or perhaps exactly as he intended it. She was not sure. Perry Warren was a man whose intentions she was still learning to read. They talked for 3 hours that evening. Perry told her everything, filling in the shape of her father's situation with details she had not known, explaining the mechanisms of Voss's manipulation, the forged note, the bank pressure, the courthouse connections. He told her about meeting her father 3 years earlier, before Grace had come to Kansas, when Thomas had shown up at Dustfall Ranch looking like a man carrying a mountain on his back. Thomas Brenner had told Perry the truth about the deed and asked him to hold it safe. Perry had agreed without hesitation, because he had already seen what Voss was capable of, and because Thomas Brenner was the kind of man who inspired that kind of loyalty. How did you know my father well enough for that kind of trust? Grace asked. Perry looked at his hands. He helped me once, he said. When I first came to Caldwell, there was a situation with Voss's men and Thomas intervened, put himself between me and trouble he didn't need to involve himself in. The scar, Grace said. It came out before she quite decided to say it. Perry looked up. The scar is from that, she asked carefully. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, indirectly. It is a longer story. I have time, he told her. He had come to Caldwell County from Texas in 1877, with money he had earned through several years of cattle driving, and some investments that had gone better than expected. He had come looking for a place to start over after a life that had been harder than he generally advertised. In Texas, he had been involved, briefly and unhappily, with a man named Greer who ran cattle in a manner that Perry had eventually recognized as involving stolen stock. When he had confronted Greer about it and tried to extract himself, Greer had come after him with a knife. Perry had survived. Greer had not. Perry had come to Kansas partly to put distance between himself and that history. Voss had known Greer. The two had done business together years before, and when Perry arrived in Caldwell and began building the Dustfall Ranch into something successful, Voss had eventually put together who Perry was and what had happened in Texas. He had been holding that knowledge as leverage ever since, the threat of revealing the Texas circumstances and potentially creating legal complications for Perry if he refused to cooperate on various matters. Thomas Brenner had helped Perry navigate that threat once, in the early days, using contacts with a Wichita lawyer who had clarified the legal situation in a way that significantly reduced Voss's leverage. It was the kind of help that created a bond you did not forget. Grace sat with all of this for a long time after Perry finished speaking. The lamp burned low. The prairie outside was dark and quiet. "You protected me," she finally said, "for 2 years. I tried to, and you were never going to tell me." "I was always going to tell you," he said, and his voice carried a weight of something frustrated and tender. "I was trying to find the right moment when telling you would not make your situation worse instead of better. Voss is dangerous, Grace. Not in a way that announces itself, but in a way that works quietly over years. I needed to be sure that when you knew about the deed, there was a plan in place for what happened next. And is there?" He met her eyes. "I've been working on it." She looked at this man across the lamplit table, this scarred, private, careful man who had been quietly standing between her and her father's enemies for 2 years, and she felt something give way inside her that she had been holding carefully rigid for a long time. It was not gratitude alone, though there was gratitude in it. It was something larger and more dangerous than gratitude. It was the beginning of the kind of love that does not announce itself but arrives fully formed, as if it has been there all along and you have simply been the last to know. She did not say any of that. She said, "Then tell me the plan." They worked on it together over the weeks that followed, and working on it together changed things between them in ways that were not directly spoken of but were felt. They reviewed the deed together, verifying the legal situation with a careful letter to the Wichita lawyer whose name Thomas Brenner had given Perry. They learned that the transfer of the deed was valid and recorded, and that Grace Brenner's ownership of the North Pasture was legally sound. Voss could threaten and maneuver, but the land was hers. The challenge was the practical reality of Hector Voss, who was not a man who accepted legal realities he did not like. His track record demonstrated clearly that he was willing to manufacture circumstances that overrode legal realities when he found it necessary. The forged promissory note that had destroyed Thomas Brenner's homestead was Exhibit 1 in that argument. Perry proposed that Grace formally register the deed with the county recorder in Caldwell, making it a matter of public record that could not be quietly made to disappear. He also proposed that they engage the Wichita lawyer to represent her interests directly, creating a documented legal trail that would make any move against the deed by Voss both visible and difficult to execute without consequences. Grace had a different idea. "The judge," she said one evening when they were sitting on the porch after supper, the late summer heat finally breaking toward something cooler. "Judge Harker in Caldwell. You said he bends for Voss." "He does," Perry said. "He has for years." "Why?" Perry looked at her. "What do you mean?" "Men like Harker bend for men like Voss because Voss has something on them," Grace said. "Something they cannot afford to have known." "What does Voss have on Harker?" Perry was quiet for a moment, and then something in his expression shifted toward respect. "You think if we know what Voss holds over Harker, we can neutralize it?" "I think if Judge Harker knows that the thing Voss is using against him is no longer the exclusive property of Voss, the judge might develop a more independent judicial perspective." Perry looked at her with undisguised admiration. "That is either very clever or very dangerous." "In this territory," Grace said, "I find those two things tend to go together." The smile that came across Perry Warren's scarred face then was the first full smile she had seen from him. not the slight upward curve he sometimes offered, but an actual smile that changed the whole landscape of his face and made him unexpectedly, profoundly handsome. It caught her off guard. She looked away quickly, back toward the darkened prairie. "Your father's daughter," Perry said, with a warmth in his voice that she felt down to her heels. She did not respond, but she was smiling too. What they discovered about Judge Harker in the following weeks, through careful inquiry and a contact Perry had in the land office, was that the judge had signed off on 3 property transfers in the previous decade that had involved land that had previously been claimed by the Osage under treaty rights that were technically still in dispute. Voss had been the beneficiary of all 3 transfers, and Harker had facilitated them in exchange for a financial arrangement that would have ended his career, and possibly his freedom if it had become known. Voss had the records, kept as insurance against the day Harker might become uncooperative. Grace wrote a very careful letter to a federal land commissioner she had read about in the Caldwell newspaper, a man from Washington who was reviewing contested land claims in the territory as part of a larger federal effort. She did not accuse anyone of anything. She asked questions, specifically about the process by which federal land commissioners reviewed treaty-related land transfers that might have been executed irregularly. She mentioned no names. The letter was a signal flare. If a federal inquiry into land transfers began in Caldwell County, the last thing Judge Harker would want was for his connection to Voss's irregular transactions to come under scrutiny. It was a knife held at a distance, making its presence known without yet being thrown. Grace mailed the letter from Wichita on a day when she rode there with Perry on the pretext of supply purchasing. She had told Perry what she was doing. He had read the letter twice and then handed it back to her with that expression of serious approval that she was learning to treasure. "You are the most strategically minded person I have met in my life," he said. "I learned from necessity," she said. 3 years of fighting a landlord in St. Louis, who was always trying to raise the rent on women who worked alone, teaches you a few things. "Tell me about St. Louis," he said, and the fact that he asked, that he wanted to know, felt like something significant. She told him about St. Louis on the ride back to Dustfall. The seamstress work, the small boarding house where she had lived, the women she had known there, some of them brave and some of them broken, and all of them navigating the particular difficulty of living alone in a world that preferred women to have men in front of them. She told him about the loneliness of it, which she had managed but never quite vanquished, and about the anger she had carried over her father's situation, and the way the anger had been useful, a fuel that kept her moving when moving was hard. Perry listened to all of it without interrupting. When she finished, the silence stretched comfortably between them, the way it did between people who have learned that not everything needs to be filled with words. "You are not lonely here," he said after a while. It was almost a question. She thought about it honestly, which was the only way she knew how to think. "No," she said, "I am not." Neither of them said anything more about it. But the ride back to Dustfall in the golden late afternoon felt like something was being agreed to, even without words. The situation with Voss came to its crisis in October of 1882. Word reached Dustfall through one of the ranch hands who had been in town that Voss had somehow learned Grace's name was on the North Pasture deed, and that he had sent 2 men to the county recorder's office to search for any registration. They found nothing, because the deed had not yet been filed locally. But the search itself signaled that Voss was moving from patient pressure to active pursuit. Perry told Grace that evening, and she received the news with the calm of a woman who had been expecting it. "It's time," she said. "For what?" "For all of it. We file the deed Monday morning. We have the Wichita lawyer here by the end of the week. And you tell me whether Judge Harker has received any communication from the Federal Land Commissioner's office, because I believe he has." Perry did in fact have information on this last point. A mutual acquaintance in Caldwell, a man at the post office who was Perry's eyes and ears in town, had mentioned that Judge Harker had been seen looking extremely unwell on the day after the federal land commissioner's annual letter to local judiciary had arrived. The judge had taken 2 days off, which was unprecedented. He received something, Perry confirmed. Then Hector Voss's insurance against the judge may have just become worthless, Grace said, and Voss doesn't know it yet. She was right. The North Pasture deed was filed at the county recorder's office on Monday morning, with Perry and Grace both present, and the Wichita lawyer represented by a local associate who had been retained to act on Grace's behalf. The deed was registered under Grace Brenner's name, recorded in the county books, and copies were made and held by the lawyer in Wichita and by Grace herself. Hector Voss's response was immediate and furious. He sent a man to Perry with a written demand that Perry disavow any interest in the North Pasture and cooperate with Voss's acquisition of it. Perry sent the man back with a written response that was cordial in its language and absolute in its refusal. Voss then attempted to bring a legal challenge against the deed's validity. He retained a Caldwell attorney who filed a motion before Judge Harker to examine the chain of title on the North Pasture and contest the Wichita recording. Judge Harker declined the motion. It was a small thing on paper, a single procedural ruling, but in the context of Caldwell County in 1882, it was enormous. Harker had declined to do what Voss wanted. Everyone who knew how that courthouse operated understood what it meant. Something had changed. Whatever hold Voss had possessed over the judge had been weakened or broken. Voss filed again with a different procedural approach. Harker declined again. The third time, Harker's written ruling contained language that, while carefully judicial in its framing, made clear that the North Pasture title was valid, properly recorded, and not subject to successful challenge under the law as it stood. Grace Brenner owned the North Pasture. It was settled. She received the news from the Wichita lawyer's letter on a Wednesday afternoon in November of 1882, and she sat at the kitchen table reading it twice. And then she pressed her hands flat on the table and breathed carefully, because the feeling in her chest was almost too large to contain. It was grief and joy and relief and something else, something that had her father's face in it, the face she remembered from those long-ago afternoons standing by the creek in the North Pasture, his big calloused hand holding hers. It had always been meant to belong to her. She heard Perry's boots on the porch before he came through the door, his characteristic unhurried tread. He came into the kitchen and looked at her face and read what was there with the accuracy that she had come to rely on. "It's done?" he asked. "It's done," she said. He stood very still for a moment. Then he crossed the kitchen and sat down across from her, and when he looked at her there was something in his face that was different from every other time she had looked at it. The careful management was gone. All of the controlled distance, the measured quality, the keeping of things behind glass. It was all gone, and what was underneath was something that made her breath catch. "Grace," he said. She waited. "I have been," he started and then stopped and tried again. "There are things I want to say to you that I have not said because the circumstances have not been right. And I am aware that I used the circumstances as an excuse at times when the truth is that I was afraid." She looked at this man, this complicated, honorable, frightened man, and felt something in her soften completely. "Perry," she said, "I am not going anywhere." He looked at her. "I know that. That is what makes it possible to say this." He reached across the table and his scarred hand covered hers. "I love you. I have loved you for a considerable time, and I have been managing it very badly by trying not to show it, which I suspect I have also done badly." Grace turned her hand over under his so that their fingers laced together. "You have done it extraordinarily badly," she said, with a smile that she could feel spreading across her face against all her best intentions to be dignified about this. It was very obvious. Something that might have been embarrassment moved across his face, and then he laughed, a real laugh, low and warm, and she thought she had never heard anything she liked better. "I love you," she said back, because it was true, and because it had been true for long enough that it deserved to be said plainly. "I have been managing it badly too." He held her hand on the table, and outside the Kansas autumn was going about its business with the wind and the long grass and the particular brilliance of November light on the prairie. And inside the Dustfall Ranch kitchen, two people sat with a very long shared history between them and a future that was just becoming visible. There was a great deal still to negotiate. The status of Grace's employment, the question of the North Pasture and what she intended to do with it now that it was confirmed as hers. The matter of Hector Voss, who had been neutralized but not destroyed, and who would remain a presence in Caldwell County that required ongoing attention. These were the practical things. They dealt with them, one at a time, with the particular efficiency of two people who have learned to think together. Grace's employment was the simplest. It ended because the woman who owned 40 acres of the finest grazing land in the county was not a housekeeper, and they both knew it. The question of what she was instead took slightly longer to settle. Perry asked her to marry him in December of 1882, on the North Pasture, standing in the dry winter grass by the old cottonwood trees along the creek. He had no ring with him because he had not planned it that moment, but he had been carrying the intention for weeks, and the moment had presented itself when they were standing in the place that was most central to both their histories in a way that felt absolutely right. "I want to build something here with you," he said, with the simplicity of a man who has finally stopped managing his words and is just using them. Not just the land, the life, everything. Grace had looked at the North Pasture in the December light, the dry grass pale gold and the creek ice-edged at its banks, and she had thought of her father standing in this same place with her small hand in his, telling her the land was special. "Yes," she said, and she meant it with her whole heart. They were married in February of 1883 at the small church in Caldwell, a quiet ceremony with the ranch hands in attendance and the Wichita lawyer present as a guest who had become, over the preceding months, something like a friend. Grace wore a dark blue dress that she had sewn herself from fabric she ordered from Wichita, and Perry wore his best suit and looked, she thought, like the most handsome man she had ever seen, scar and all. Judge Harker, whose relationship with Voss had apparently entirely collapsed in the wake of his two decline motions, was notably present at the wedding, having inserted himself with an awkward and clearly genuine desire to demonstrate goodwill toward Grace Brenner, whose acquisition of the North Pasture he had ultimately, if belatedly, protected. Grace was gracious to him, because she was gracious by nature, but she was watching him. Hector Voss did not appear at the wedding. He would never again appear at Dustfall Ranch. The spring of 1883 brought new growth in more ways than one. Grace began developing the North Pasture not just as grazing land, but as a deliberate and managed part of the Dustfall operation, bringing her own ideas to the cattle management that Perry received with an open mind, and then enthusiastic adoption as the results proved themselves. She had grown up on this land. She knew it in her bones. The creek management she proposed, the rotation of grazing to protect the bottomland, the small improvements to the water infrastructure along the creek line, all of it worked, and the North Pasture in the summer of 1883 was producing better than it ever had. Perry watched her work with an expression that she was learning to recognize as the one he got when he was proud of something, but did not know how to say it without it sounding like he was surprised, which he was not. He told her once, lying in the dark after a long evening of discussing the ranch's finances, that he sometimes thought she was the one who should be running Dustfall, not him. "We are running it together," she said. "That is how I prefer it." "Then we are running it together," he said, and she could hear the smile in it even in the dark. Hector Voss did not go quietly, because men like Voss never did, but his efforts became increasingly futile as the year progressed. The federal land commissioner had indeed opened a review of several Caldwell County land transfers, and while the review moved with the typical slowness of federal processes, its existence was enough to keep Voss occupied with defensive concern that left him less bandwidth for offensive ones. By the summer of 1883, His attention was focused almost entirely on protecting what he already had rather than acquiring what he wanted. And Grace Brenner's North Pasture had become too legally established, too publicly registered, and too well represented by counsel to be a viable target for the kind of quiet manipulation that had worked against Thomas Brenner a decade before. It was a Tuesday evening in September of 1883 when everything came full circle. Grace was in the main house kitchen, which had become her kitchen in a way that the small room off the side had never quite been, when Perry came in from his study with something in his hand. He sat down at the table across from her and set it down between them, and she looked at it and felt the whole weight of the past 2.5 years settle into the present moment. It was the North Pasture deed. The original, the one her father had given to Perry for safekeeping, the one that had her name on it in Thomas Brenner's careful handwriting, put there years before she had ever thought to come back to Kansas. "I have been meaning to give this to you properly," Perry said. "Not just the registered copy, the original. This is yours. It has always been yours." He pushed it across the table toward her. She looked at it. She looked at his face, at the scar that she knew so well now that she could not quite reconstruct the discomfort she had first felt seeing it, at the gray eyes that held so much more than they showed and that showed more to her than to anyone else alive. "This was always meant to belong to you," he said quietly. She picked up the deed. She held her father's handwriting in her hands, the careful letters of her own name, the date he had put on it, years before she had needed it, the quiet act of a father who had loved his daughter and had thought ahead as far as he could and had done the best he knew how to do. She did not cry. She had cried for her father many times in private, and she had made her peace with the grief the way you make peace with weather, not by making it stop, but by learning to stand in it. She held the deed and felt her father very present, and she felt her husband across the table watching her with the quality of attention that had always been his finest quality, full and undemanding and completely hers. "Thank you," she said, and she meant everything in it, the 2 years of keeping it safe, the months of working with her to secure it, the marriage and the ranch and the life they were building, and all the things not yet built that were still becoming visible. "Your father trusted me with the most important thing he had," Perry said. "Getting it to you was the easiest thing I have ever done." She reached across and took his hand the way she had that November evening a year before, their fingers lacing together over the deed on the table between them. Outside, the September wind moved through the tall grass of the North Pasture, the same wind that had moved through it when Thomas Brenner first broke the soil, and when Grace had stood there as a child, and when Perry had stood there alone in the cold wondering when the right moment would come. The cottonwoods along the creek were beginning to turn gold at the edges, the way they did every autumn, reliable as anything in the world. They sat together in the kitchen until the lamp burned low, not saying much, the way people sit when they have said everything that matters and are content to let the silence hold the rest. The winter of 1883 into 1884 was a good one by Kansas standards, meaning it was hard but not brutal, and Dustfall Ranch came through it with the herd intact and the operations running smoothly under the joint management that Grace and Perry had developed into something almost intuitive over the preceding year. They worked well together, which Grace had suspected from early on, partly because their temperaments complemented each other in useful ways. Perry was patient where she was urgent, thorough where she was decisive, and she brought an energy and creative problem-solving to the operation that kept things moving when they might otherwise have stalled. They argued sometimes, as people who work together and love each other will, and the arguments were honest and occasionally loud and always resolved because neither of them was the type to let things fester. Perry had a particular quality in an argument that she had come to appreciate, which was that he was always willing to be wrong. It was rarer than it should have been in men, and she valued it. The news of Grace's pregnancy came in March of 1884, and Perry received it with the particular stillness that meant he was very moved and was processing the moving. He looked at her across the breakfast table on the morning she told him, and she watched something unfold in his face that was close to wonder. "Are you well?" he asked first, which she thought was characteristic and perfect. "Perfectly well," she said. "Strong as I have ever been." "Good," he said, and then after a moment, "Grace." "I know," she said. The baby came in late November of 1884, a boy, born during a clear cold night with a full moon turning the North Pasture silver outside the bedroom window. The local doctor attended, a young man from Ohio named Simmons who had arrived in Caldwell the previous year and was, unlike his predecessor, not in Hector Voss's pocket in any way. The birth was hard, as first births tended to be, and Grace was iron throughout it, which surprised no one who knew her. Perry was in the next room for most of it, which was the custom, but she heard him once ask Dr. Simmons a question through the door, and the question was so clearly driven by barely managed fear that she had laughed despite everything, which the doctor reported to Perry as a sign that things were going well. They named the boy Thomas for her father. Thomas James Warren, born at Dustfall Ranch on November 22, 1884, which felt like a kind of completion. Perry held his son for the first time in the gray-gold light of the Kansas morning, sitting in the chair by the bed while Grace rested, and she watched his face do something that she had never seen it do before, which was to let go entirely of every guard and every careful management, and just be what it was, open and full, and completely without the distance that had once been his armor. "Hello," he said, very quietly, to the small person in his arms. "I have been thinking about you for a long time." Grace watched them, father and son, the scarred man and the new person who had no scars yet, and she thought that love in its various forms was the most extraordinary thing she had ever seen. Thomas Brenner Warren grew quickly, the way children on ranches do, fed on good air and honest work and parents who paid attention. He had Perry's gray eyes and Grace's dark hair, and the combination was striking in a way that made people stop and look, though Thomas himself was indifferent to being looked at, which he came by honestly from both parents. By the time Thomas was 2 and beginning to demonstrate the particular willfulness that the combination of Perry's stubbornness and Grace's determination was always going to produce, the Federal Review of Caldwell County Land Transfers had concluded. The findings were not publicly dramatic, federal processes rarely were, but they resulted in 3 land transfers being voided as having been executed irregularly, and Hector Voss being assessed a significant financial penalty related to his involvement in the transfer processes. It did not destroy him. A man of his resources was not easily destroyed by a financial penalty, but it fundamentally altered his position in Caldwell County. Judge Harker chose not to stand for re-election in 1885, citing health reasons. His replacement was a younger man from Topeka with no prior relationship to Voss, and a reputation for genuine impartiality that, while novel in the Caldwell County Courthouse, was widely welcomed. Voss himself was never prosecuted for what he had done to Thomas Brenner, because the forged promissory note had been destroyed, and the witnesses were either dead or unavailable, and the statute of limitations on the civil judgment made any legal remedy for the original injustice practically impossible. Grace had known this for years and had made her peace with it, not easily and not completely, because some injustices do not resolve cleanly, but thoroughly enough that it did not sit in her chest like a stone. Her father's land was safe. His name was on the deed that had become her name, in a sense, carrying forward what he had built. That was what justice looked like on the frontier, not always clean but real. She told Perry once, late at night when Thomas was asleep and the house was quiet, that she thought her father would be satisfied. Not pleased with everything, she said. He would have wanted Voss held accountable for the forged note. He was that kind of man, but satisfied, yes. He would have been satisfied that the land held. He would have been proud of you, Perry said. He said it simply, without embellishment, the way he said things that were absolutely true. She thought he was right, and she let herself feel that, let herself accept it without deflecting it, which was something she had gotten better at over the years. The spring of 1886 brought a second pregnancy, and Grace approached it with the confidence of a woman who had done this before, which made everything slightly easier, though not entirely easy, because nothing about having a child is entirely easy regardless of how confident the mother is. Perry was attentive throughout in the way that he was attentive to everything important, quietly, consistently, present. This baby was a girl, born in August of 1886 on a hot evening when the thunderheads were piling up to the southwest and the horses were restless in the paddocks. They named her Martha, for Perry's mother, who had died when he was young and whom he rarely spoke about but who was clearly a presence he carried. Martha Warren, from her earliest moments, was a person with an extremely strong opinion about everything, which was apparent to all present and which made Thomas, who was 20 months older and had been enjoying being the sole focus of considerable adult attention, initially uncertain about this new development. His uncertainty resolved itself within approximately 2 weeks into a possessive devotion to his sister that everyone at Dustfall found simultaneously exhausting and completely endearing. Grace watched her children with a quality of attention that she recognized as her father's, that particular wide-awake watching that people do when they know that time is moving, and they want to actually see what is in front of them rather than arriving at the memory later and realizing they had looked but not seen. Dustfall Ranch had grown into something Thomas Brenner might not have recognized in size, but would have known immediately in character. The North Pasture was the heart of it still, those 40 acres of bottomland with the creek and the cottonwoods, the piece of land that had started everything. Grace rode out there often, sometimes alone and sometimes with the children, and occasionally with Perry, and the land was as beautiful as it had ever been, the creek running clear and the grass thick, and the cottonwoods growing imperceptibly taller season by season. One afternoon in the autumn of 1887, Grace was standing at the fence line of the North Pasture with 4-year-old Thomas beside her and 18-month-old Martha on her hip, and Perry rode up from the direction of the main pasture and reined in at the fence. He looked at his family and the land and the golden afternoon light, and his expression was the one she knew best from him now, the one that had been there since the night they finally told each other the truth, open and full and entirely unguarded. "What are you thinking?" she asked. He looked at the North Pasture and then at her. "I am thinking that your father was right," he said. Thomas pulled at Grace's skirt. "About what, Papa?" Perry looked down at his son with the slow smile that had never stopped being extraordinary to Grace in its transformation of his face. "About this land being special," Perry said. "He always knew it. He was right." Thomas accepted this with the earnest gravity of a 4-year-old receiving important information, and then turned back to the fence to look at the cattle grazing in the bottomland, apparently satisfied. Martha, who had her own opinions, reached out from Grace's hip and pointed imperiously at a cottonwood tree and said something that was almost but not quite a word, and Perry dismounted and came to stand beside Grace at the fence and put his arm around her shoulders, and she leaned into him, the familiar solid warmth of him, and the 4 of them stood there together in the late autumn afternoon of the Kansas plains. The wind moved through the North Pasture the way it always had, the way it would long after any of them were there to feel it, bending the tall grass in long rippling waves that looked like nothing so much as water, like a sea of gold and green stretching out to the blue horizon. The cottonwoods along the creek turned and turned in the breeze, their leaves beginning to color toward yellow, and the cattle moved slowly through the rich bottomland grass, with the particular contentment of animals who do not know they are in a beautiful place, but seem somehow to benefit from it anyway. Grace Brenner Warren, who had come to Kansas with $23 and a carpetbag and a grief as big as the sky, stood on the land her father had given her before she knew she needed it, with the husband she had not expected, and the children she had not dared to imagine, and the life that had grown up around her over the years the way good things grow, quietly and with deep roots. She was 30 years old. The North Pasture deed was in her name and registered in 3 counties, and held by a lawyer in Wichita, and there was nothing in the world that could take it from her. The injustice that had been done to her father had been answered as fully as the world allowed injustices to be answered, which was not perfectly and not completely, but enough to let the land be what it was meant to be, and let the people on it live the life they were meant to live. Perry pressed a kiss to her temple, the gesture so habitual now that it was as natural as breathing, and Martha grabbed at his hat, and Thomas said something about wanting to go see the horses, and the ordinary afternoon of an ordinary family on a working Kansas cattle ranch proceeded with all of its small and irreplaceable particulars. Later, when the children were in bed and the house was quiet, Grace sat at the kitchen table with the original North Pasture deed in her hands, the way she sometimes did in the evenings, not reading it exactly but holding it. Perry came in from checking the horses and poured 2 cups of coffee and set one in front of her and sat down across the table with his own. He looked at the deed and then at her, and there was a conversation in that look that did not need words because they had been having it for years and knew it by heart. "Thomas told me today that he is going to build a house on the North Pasture when he is grown up," Perry said. Grace smiled at the deed in her hands. "He told me the same thing last week. He is very decided about it. He is his father's son," she said. Perry raised an eyebrow. "I believe the decision-making comes from his mother. The stubbornness comes from his father," she said pleasantly. Perry drank his coffee. "I suppose we will have to build 2 houses eventually. Martha will want her own North Pasture." "Martha will want someone else's North Pasture," Grace said. "She is more ambitious than Thomas." "More ambitious than me," Perry said, and his voice was rich with affectionate resignation. Grace looked across the table at this man she had come to know more thoroughly than she had known anyone in her life. This complicated and honorable and occasionally infuriating man who had stood between her and danger, she had not known existed, and kept a promise to a man who was gone, and told her the truth when it needed telling, and held her hand over the table the November evening when everything changed. "I love you," she said, because it was the end of a long day and the children were asleep, and there was coffee on the table, and the lamp was burning, and some things were simply and completely true. "I love you," he said back, with the directness that he had finally, after years of careful management, brought to everything he said to her. Outside, the Kansas night was clear and enormous and very cold, with stars that went all the way to the horizon and the dry smell of autumn grass on the wind. The North Pasture lay in the moonlight as it always did, the creek a darker line through the silver land, the cottonwoods tall and still in the cold air. Thomas Brenner had stood on that land 30 years before with nothing but hope and hard hands and the knowledge that good soil, tended rightly, yields more than you can predict from a single season. He had put his daughter's name on the deed before she was old enough to need it, because that was the kind of man he was, the kind who thought ahead through love, who built things that would outlast him. The land had held, the name had held, the love had held, the way things hold when they are rooted in the right soil. Grace set the deed on the table and took her husband's hand, and listened to the wind move through the North Pasture in the dark, and was entirely and completely home.